She wasn't kidnapped. She wasn't lost. She was handed over by her own blood, traded to a stranger for a fistful of silver coins like something with a price tag, not a name. Evelyn Hart was hauled deep into the frozen mountains and left at the door of a man the frontier called cold, dangerous, and better left alone. She expected a life of hard labor and slow disappearance. What she found instead was a locked door, and behind it, a dying baby no one was supposed to know about. The moment she broke that lock, everything changed. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The morning Evelyn Hart left the only home she had ever known, the sky was the color of dirty wool, flat, gray, and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. She sat in the back of her uncle's wagon with a single canvas bag between her boots and her coat pulled tight around her shoulders. The coat had belonged to her mother. It still smelled faintly of her, or maybe Evelyn only imagined that it did, because the truth was, her mother had been gone for 8 months, and memory has a way of lying to you when you need it most. Raymond Hart sat up front with the reins in his hands and didn't speak. He hadn't spoken to her since the night before, when he'd come into the kitchen with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere above her head and explained, not asked, explained, what was going to happen. He spoke in the same voice he used when he was negotiating livestock prices, flat, practical, a little tired. "I've made arrangements," he said. Evelyn had stood very still. "There's a man up in the Blackhorn Range who needs someone to keep his place. Cook, clean, that sort of work." He set his hat on the table and smoothed the brim with 2 fingers. "He'll pay a fair rate. You'll have a roof." "Uncle Raymond," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You're sending me away." "I'm finding you a situation." He finally looked at her. "What do you expect me to do, Evelyn? You can't stay here. The farm's barely keeping us alive as it is, and Thomas is gone. There's no husband coming. There's no money coming. I've got my own children to think about." Thomas. Her husband of 14 months, dead of a fever before their first anniversary was properly passed, and with him had gone the baby she'd been carrying. Too much grief at once, the doctor said, the body shutting down under the weight of it. She had lost everything in the span of 6 weeks, and then spent the following months being tolerated in her uncle's house, like a piece of furniture nobody wanted but couldn't be bothered to move. She hadn't cried the night Raymond told her. She wasn't sure she had anything left to cry with. Now the wagon climbed into the foothills north of Cutter's Creek, the trail narrowing as the pine trees thickened on either side, and the temperature dropped with every mile gained in elevation. It was October, but up here it felt like December. The peaks above the tree line were already white. Evelyn watched them and tried to remember the last time she'd felt warm. She didn't know the man's name yet. Raymond hadn't offered it, and she hadn't asked, some stubborn piece of her refusing to give him the satisfaction of her curiosity. But around midday, when they stopped to water the horse at a creek crossing, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and set it on the seat between them. "His name's Colton Voss." Raymond kept his eyes on the horse. "He's a trapper, works the upper ridges, decent earner, I'm told." "Who told you?" "Man at the feed store knows him, said he's reliable." Evelyn picked up the paper. It was a letter, short and written in blocky, unpracticed handwriting. "Need capable woman. Keep the cabin. Cook and tend. Will pay silver. No trouble wanted. No trouble given. C. Voss." She read it twice. No trouble wanted, as if she were the one likely to cause it. "What does he know about me?" she asked. "Enough." "What does that mean?" Raymond finally turned to look at her, and for just a moment something passed over his face that might have been guilt or might have been impatience. She could never tell with him. "It means I told him you're a widow, that you're capable, that you need a place." "And what did he pay you?" The silence that followed told her everything. "Raymond," her voice was very quiet, "what did he pay you for me?" He reached back for the reins. "We should keep moving." She wanted to hit him. She wanted to scream. Instead, she folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket. Not because she wanted it, but because something told her she might need to know what she'd agreed to, even if she'd never agreed to it at all. Then she climbed back onto the wagon seat and watched the trees close around them and said nothing for the rest of the drive. Colton Voss's cabin was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. Something grim and squalid, probably, something that matched the letter's blunt tone. But the cabin itself was well built, solid logs fitted tight against each other, a stone chimney running up the south wall, a woodpile stacked so high and neatly along the east side that it looked almost architectural. There was a small barn set back in the trees, a skinning rack off to the side with nothing on it at the moment, a root cellar with a heavy door. The clearing it sat in was perhaps 100 yards wide, ringed by dark spruce and fir, with the mountain rising steeply behind it. Snow had fallen recently, the evidence was still thick on the branches. But the path from the tree line to the cabin door had been cleared. Colton Voss was standing in that cleared path when the wagon came out of the trees. He was taller than she'd imagined and broader across the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that had gone past the point of intention into something closer to neglect. He wore canvas work pants and a heavy wool shirt despite the cold, sleeves pushed to the elbow, and he watched the wagon approach with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Raymond pulled up and climbed down. The two men shook hands with the brief efficiency of men who had met before, or who at least moved in worlds where too much ceremony was considered a waste of everyone's time. Voss? Hart. Raymond turned back toward the wagon. This is Evelyn. She climbed down without waiting for help and stood in the snow with her canvas bag and looked at Colton Voss directly, because if she was going to be traded like a sack of grain, she was at least going to look the man in the eye while it happened. He looked back at her. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they were difficult to read. Not unfriendly exactly, but guarded in the way of someone who had learned to hold everything back as a matter of practice. "You'll need boots," he said. She blinked. Of everything he might have said, this hadn't been on the list. "I have boots. Better ones." He looked at her feet, at the boots she was wearing. Okay, practical enough for town, not for this. "There's a pair inside that belong to my... There are boots inside that should fit you. We'll see." Raymond was already pulling back into the wagon seat. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look at her again. She heard him turn the horse, and then the creak and thud of the wagon retreating back through the trees, and then there was only the sound of wind in the spruce and a raven calling somewhere up the ridge, and the extraordinary silence of a place that was very far from anywhere she had ever been. She turned back to Colton Voss. "Well," she said. He nodded toward the cabin. "I'll show you where things are." The inside of the cabin was clean, which surprised her. She'd assumed, and now felt briefly ashamed of the assumption, that a solitary man in a remote location would have let the place go to ruin. But the floor was swept, the cook stove had been recently blacked, the surfaces were clear, and the single window on the south wall let in enough of the October light to make the space feel less oppressive than it might have. There was a sleeping loft above, accessed by a steep wooden ladder, a small table with 2 chairs, a shelf of dry goods, flour, oats, salt, cornmeal, some canned goods she didn't recognize the labels of. Trapping equipment hung along the east wall in rows that had the same methodical quality as the woodpile outside. Everything had its place. There was a second shelf above the stove that held 3 or 4 books, their spines cracked from use, a pair of wool socks drying on the back of a chair, a coffee tin on the table with the lid set crooked, like he'd just walked away from it. "You'll sleep in the loft," Colton said, standing near the door. "I sleep down here." She looked at the ladder. "All right. Meals at first light and after dark. I'll be out on the line most days. You keep the fire, keep the cabin, do what needs doing." He said it like he was reading from a list he'd prepared in advance. "There's a list on the shelf of what we need before the heavy snow. Things that run out, you write them down. I'll bring them up from Millhaven when I go." "How often do you go to Millhaven?" "When I need to." She waited to see if he'd say anything else. He didn't. "Is that everything?" His jaw tightened slightly. "There's a door up in the loft, on the north side. It's locked, and it stays locked. That's not your concern." She glanced up toward the loft. From where she stood, she couldn't see the upper level clearly, just the bottom of the hatch and the edge of the sleeping platform. All right, she said again. He looked at her for a moment, as if measuring whether she meant it. Then he picked up his coat from the hook by the door and went back outside. And she heard him head toward the barn. And that was the introduction. The first week was purely functional. Evelyn had always been capable. Her mother had made sure of that, believing firmly that a woman who could not manage a household was a woman who would always be at someone else's mercy. Evelyn could cook, preserve, clean, mend, garden if there was a garden, and manage a fire in weather that tried hard to put it out. She was not delicate, and she had never pretended to be. So she learned the cabin. She learned the stove's particular temperament, the way the draft had to be adjusted for the elevation, the way the front left burner ran hot and the back right ran cold. She took inventory of the dry goods and made the list Colton had mentioned. She found the boots he'd referenced, women's boots, good ones, well-made and barely worn, and tried them on and found they were half a size too large, which she fixed with an extra pair of socks. She did not ask about the boots. Colton came and went without much conversation. He'd leave before first light most mornings, come back around dusk, eat what she'd made with the focused efficiency of someone fueling a machine rather than enjoying a meal, and then sit for a while near the stove before climbing into his bedroll on the floor. He didn't complain about the food. He didn't compliment it either. He just ate it and was quiet. She tried once to draw him into something more. She'd made a venison stew that had turned out particularly well, and when he sat down, she said without quite knowing why, "The rosemary helps. I found some dried rosemary on the shelf." He looked at the stew. "My wife grew it." The silence after that sat between them like a stone. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "It's good stew." He picked up his spoon, that was all. She ate the rest of the meal without speaking and decided that some things were better left alone. On the fifth night, she was lying awake in the loft, listening to the wind come off the mountain and thinking about Thomas, his laugh, the way he'd been particular about his coffee, the scar on his chin from a childhood fall. When she heard it, a sound from above her, which didn't make sense, because the loft was the highest point in the cabin. The ceiling sloped with the roofline on the south side, but leveled off toward the north, and on the north side of the loft, behind the locked door, was a space she'd assumed was storage. She lay still and listened. There it was again. Faint. High. The unmistakable sound of an infant crying. Evelyn sat up. She sat there in the dark with her heart moving strangely in her chest, listening to that thin, exhausted cry. Not the full-lunged wail of a healthy baby, but something smaller, weaker, as if the sound was coming from a creature that had spent a long time making it and was running out of the strength to continue. She got up. She crossed the loft on bare feet in the cold, and she put her hand against the locked door and listened, and the cry came again, unmistakable now, right on the other side of the wood. "Voss?" She went to the loft edge and called down into the dark. "Voss?" A pause. Then the sound of him shifting. "What?" "There's a baby in there." Another pause. Longer. "Go back to sleep." She stared down into the darkness of the main room. The fire had burned to coals, and she could barely make out the shape of him in his bedroll. "There's a baby crying behind that door right now. I am standing here and I can hear it." I said, "Go back to sleep, Evelyn." She had never heard him use her name before. It landed strangely, like he was trying to hold something in place by naming it. "Is it yours?" she asked. The silence went on for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Yes." "How long has it been in there?" "That's not your business." She put her hand back on the locked door and felt the cold radiating through the wood, because the north side of the cabin didn't get the stove's heat. Not really, not with that door closed tight. And the cry came again, thin and ragged and terrifyingly quiet. She went back to her pack and found the small knife she kept there, and was back at the door in 30 seconds. "Evelyn?" His voice had gone sharp, warning. "I'm going in," she said. "That door is locked for a reason." "I don't doubt it." She worked the knife into the latch mechanism. She'd done this before, on a stuck pantry door at her uncle's house, and the principle was the same. "And I'm sure you'll tell me what the reason is when you're ready to." The latch gave with a dry click. "But there is a baby crying in this room, and I am going in." She pushed the door open. The cold hit her first, a solid, different cold than the rest of the loft, still and dense and carrying the smell of soiled cloth and something sour underneath. She could see almost nothing. She went back for the candle on the shelf beside her bed and brought it through the door, and in its small, wavering light, she found him. He was in a wooden box that had been fitted with a mattress of folded blankets, a makeshift crib, improvised but not uncaring. He was very small and very thin, with dark hair matted against his head and skin that looked papery in the candlelight. He'd been crying, but now he was just lying there looking at the light she'd brought in, his eyes too large in his face, his chest working in small, rapid movements. He couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 months old. Evelyn set the candle down on the floor and picked him up, and he weighed almost nothing, and the cloth wrapped around him was cold and wet, and she felt something tear open in her chest that she hadn't known was still capable of tearing. She held him against her and felt his small body working for warmth, and she turned and walked out of that room and down the ladder one-handed, which was awkward and probably not safe, and she didn't care. Colton was standing in the middle of the main room with the fire stoked back up. He must have moved when he heard the door go. He was watching her come down with an expression she couldn't read, something complicated locked inside a face that had trained itself not to show anything. "Give him to me," he said. "I will not." She went to the stove and stood close to it with the baby pressed to her chest. "He's soaked through. He needs to be changed. He needs to eat." She looked at Colton. "When did he eat last?" Colton said nothing. "When?" Her voice was harder than she expected it to be. "This morning." A pause. "Early morning." It was past midnight. "What are you feeding him?" "Goat milk. There's a nanny in the barn." "Warm it." He looked at her for a long moment with that unreadable expression, and she looked back at him with the baby held against her and waited. She didn't have the energy to argue. She was too angry and too tired and something else, something that didn't have a name yet, something she'd thought was gone. He went to the barn. She found a dry cloth on the shelf, changed the baby by the stove's warmth, wrapped him tight the way she remembered from before, the way that seemed to settle them, that sense of being held on all sides. He watched her with those 2 large eyes and didn't cry, just watched. "All right," she told him quietly. "All right. I've got you." He had dark eyes like his father. She looked at his face and felt the unnamed thing settle into something recognizable. Colton came back with a small pot of goat milk and set it on the stove without being asked. They warmed it together in the same space, not speaking, the baby quiet now in her arms. "What's his name?" she asked. Another long pause. "Noah." "Noah." She said it to the baby, not to his father. "Hello, Noah." Colton stood a foot away with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and looked at his son in a way that was so raw and so complicated that Evelyn had to look away. She didn't ask anything else that night. There would be time for it later, or there wouldn't. But Noah ate when she fed him the warmed milk, tentatively at first, then with more focus, his tiny hands moving in that unconscious grasping way of very young babies. And she sat by the stove and held him and listened to the wind off the mountain and kept her thoughts to herself. Colton didn't go back to his bedroll. He sat in the chair by the table with his hands loose between his knees and watched his son eat and said nothing for a very long time. Finally, without looking at her, he said, "His mother died 2 months back." Evelyn kept her eyes on Noah. "I'm sorry." "The milk." He stopped, started again. "He won't take it. Not properly. I don't know how to—" He stopped again, and she could hear what the stopping was costing him. She looked at him then. He was staring at the floor. His hands had tightened. "He's taking it now," she said. Colton looked up. Noah was indeed eating, steadily, his small face scrunched in concentration. Something in Colton's expression shifted. Barely, like ice moving on a slow river. But it moved. "He needs to be somewhere warm," Evelyn said, "and he needs to eat more often than once a day, and he needs to be held." She kept her voice matter-of-fact because she sensed that matter-of-fact was what would reach him, not softness. "I can do those things, if you'll let me." He looked at her for a moment. "Why would you?" The question was genuine. That was the part that surprised her. Not hostile, not suspicious. Just honest confusion from a man who had probably stopped expecting things to come toward him instead of going away. She thought about it, sitting there in the firelight with Noah's weight in her arms. She could have said she didn't know. That was partially true. But the fuller truth, even if she wasn't ready to say it aloud to this man she'd known for 5 days, was that she'd buried a child of her own. 6 weeks along, not yet a person the world would count, but a person she'd already loved. And she'd thought that part of her had gone into the ground with Thomas and the baby both. Apparently, it hadn't. "Because he's alive," she said, "and that seems worth something." Colton said nothing. Noah had finished eating and was already drifting, his eyes heavy, the small motions of his hands going slower. Evelyn shifted him against her shoulder and rubbed his back in slow circles. "You can't put him back up there," she said. "It's too cold. He needs to be down here by the stove." Colton nodded. Once, like something had been decided. She moved Noah's makeshift crib down from the loft the next morning while Colton was on his line and set it near the stove where the heat would reach it, and spent the rest of the day learning the rhythm of him. When he was hungry, when he was gassy and needed to be held upright, when he was just unhappy and wanted to hear a voice. These were things you learned by paying attention, and Evelyn had always been good at paying attention. She talked to him while she worked. She kept her voice low and even, describing what she was doing the way her mother had once talked her through difficult tasks. The narration itself a kind of anchor. "Here's the flour, Noah. Here's how you tell when the stove's the right temperature. See how the light comes in this window in the afternoon? We can sit here after midday when the sun moves south." He listened with that serious infant attention, tracking her face when she came close, his body less rigid by the end of the day. It wasn't love yet. Not the word, not the thing in full. But something was beginning that she recognized. The weight of something starting that couldn't easily be stopped once it had started. She didn't name it, she just kept going. Chug. By the end of the second week, she had established enough of a rhythm to start looking past the immediate work and noticing things. She noticed that Colton moved differently in the cabin than he moved outside it. Outside, checking the barn or splitting wood, he was fluid and sure. A man in his element. Inside, he was careful in the wrong way, like someone navigating a space that had become unfamiliar. He didn't sit where he must have once sat. He ate at the end of the table, not the side. There was a rocking chair near the south window that he walked past every day and never touched. She noticed that the 3 books on the shelf were well read, the spines cracked, pages soft at the corners. But they hadn't been touched since she arrived. She noticed that he listened to Noah at night. She could tell by the quality of his stillness when the baby made a sound, the way it changed, not tenser but more focused, a different kind of alert. She noticed that he hadn't looked at the loft door since she'd brought Noah down. She did not try to talk to him about any of it. She left it alone the way you leave certain things in the wilderness alone, not from indifference but from the understanding that forcing a thing open too soon just breaks it. But one evening, when the snow had come back hard and the wind was making its particular sound against the northwest corner of the cabin, she was sitting near the stove with Noah asleep on her chest, and she looked up to find Colton watching them from the other side of the room. He looked away when she caught him at it. She looked back down at Noah. "He's heavier already," she said, to give him somewhere to come in if he wanted to. A pause. Then, "Is he?" "A pound, maybe. Hard to say without a scale. But he eats better, and he sleeps flatter." She felt Noah breathe. "That usually means they're filling out." Colton came and sat in the chair by the table, not close, but not as far as he usually went. Is that good? The sleeping flat thing?" "Yes. Newborns curl when they're uncomfortable. When they start to lay out more, it usually means things are settling." She glanced up. "You didn't know that." "I didn't know anything." He said it flatly, no self-pity in it, just fact. My wife was. She knew everything about that kind of thing. I just stayed out of the way." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. "What was her name?" He looked at the floor. "May." "What was she like?" The fire popped. Outside, the wind shifted direction and threw a wall of snow against the glass, and then pulled back again. "Stubborn," he said, finally. "Smart." She thought about things longer than most people, and then she'd say something that cut straight through all of it, and she'd be right. He stopped. She wasn't supposed to, The birth was supposed to be straightforward. The woman from the valley came up to help, and she said everything was going right, and then it wasn't. Evelyn nodded. There was nothing useful she could say to that, so she didn't say anything. I didn't... He stopped again, started differently. I couldn't look at him. After. I know how that sounds. It sounds like grief, she said. It doesn't have a right shape. He looked at her then, and she held the look for a second before glancing back down at Noah. She hadn't meant it as comfort exactly, just as a statement of fact. I thought he was going to die anyway, Colton said. He was so small and he wouldn't eat right, and I thought... He exhaled. I thought at least if you didn't get any closer, it wouldn't be as bad when you lost him. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Evelyn looked down at Noah's sleeping face. She understood that particular arithmetic. She'd done a version of it herself, over Thomas, over the baby, the way you try to calibrate your love down so the loss will be proportional. It never worked. The math was always wrong. You lost the time with them and got the grief anyway. He's not going to die, she said. Not a promise. She'd learned not to make promises about things she couldn't control. Just her best assessment of the situation. Not if we keep doing what we're doing. We. The word had come out without her thinking about it. Colton looked at her a little longer, then looked away, and the silence that followed was different from the silences before. Less empty. Less defensive. Noah shifted in his sleep, made a small sound, settled again. Colton watched him do it with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose, and Evelyn watched Colton and thought about the particular way damage arranges itself in a person, the places it goes to hide, the things it does to the face when it's been there long enough. The wind came back and threw another handful of snow at the window, and the fire held, and the three of them sat there in the small warm space the cabin made against the mountain's cold. It wasn't peace. Not yet. It was just the beginning of something less broken. But even that was more than she'd expected to find, riding up that mountain in her dead mother's coat with nothing but a canvas bag and a letter she hadn't agreed to. She pressed her lips briefly to the top of Noah's head, felt the warmth of him, and let herself, for the first time since everything had fallen apart, sit still inside a moment without immediately trying to get out of it. Noah gained 4 ounces in the 3rd week. Evelyn knew this because she'd started weighing him using a kitchen scale borrowed from the dry goods shelf and a cloth sling she'd fashioned from an old flour bag. A rough system, but consistent enough to track direction, and the direction was up. She recorded the numbers on the inside cover of one of Colton's cracked spine books, the one he seemed least likely to open, and checked them every few days with the focused attention of someone who understood that small improvements were the only kind the wilderness offered. Colton noticed. He didn't say anything about the scale or the cloth sling or the numbers written in the book. He just looked at Noah one morning before heading out to the line and said, "He looks less gray," and that was his version of relief. "He is less gray," Evelyn said. "His color's coming in." He stood there a moment longer than he usually did before leaving, just looking at the baby in the crib, and she pretended to be busy with the stove so he could do it without an audience. That was the rhythm of it. Small movements in the dark, neither of them making too much of anything. The cold deepened through November in a way that felt less like weather and more like a decision the mountain had made. The kind of cold that came in under the door no matter how well it was sealed, that made the stove work constantly, and still left the far corners of the cabin dim and chill. Evelyn started sleeping with Noah's crib pulled close to the stove at night, and waking twice to feed him, a routine her body adapted to faster than she expected, some old knowledge coming back to her from a time she tried not to think about directly. She thought about it anyway. She thought about it at 2 a.m. with the wind pressing at the cabin walls, and Noah's small, warm weight against her chest, and the rest of the world very far away. She'd been 23 when she lost the baby. A girl, the doctor thought, though he hadn't been certain. She'd never named her. She wished now that she had. It seemed wrong to have lost something you'd loved and not have a name to put to it. She didn't tell Colton any of this. There was no reason to, and she wasn't sure she could have gotten through it without the kind of unraveling she couldn't afford in someone else's house. But she told Noah. Softly, in the dark, while he ate and looked at her with those grave dark eyes that still seemed too wise for an infant. She told him about Thomas and about the baby girl she'd never named, and about the farm where she'd grown up before everything started going wrong. She told him about her mother's hands and the way rosemary smelled, and the particular light in the kitchen on winter mornings. She wasn't sure why she talked to him the way she did. He understood nothing, would remember nothing, but it felt less like speaking into emptiness than anything else she'd tried in the past year. And he listened, or seemed to. His attention was unreliable, as infant attention always was, prone to sudden deep interest in the ceiling or a crease in her sleeve. But sometimes she'd be mid-sentence and look down, and he'd be watching her face with that focused, slightly worried expression babies got, and she'd feel briefly less alone. "That's a lot to put on someone 3 months old," she murmured one night. Noah's response was to try to fit his fist in his mouth, which she took as non-judgment. Colton came in one afternoon in the middle of November with a cut on his forearm and blood soaking through his sleeve, and said nothing about it until she noticed and made him sit down. "How deep?" she asked, already at the shelf where she'd organized the medicine supplies. "Not very." She looked at it. It was deeper than not very, but probably not deep enough to require anything more than cleaning and binding. "What did you catch?" "Trap spring. I was careless." She cleaned the wound with the alcohol she'd found in a tin on the high shelf, and he sat with his jaw set and didn't make a sound, which she found either impressive or just typical of him by this point. When she was bandaging it, she became aware that he was looking at Noah in the crib rather than at what she was doing. "He's been awake most of the morning," she said, "watching the window. I think the snow interests him." May was like that, with weather. He said it quietly, like he hadn't entirely meant to say it out loud. Evelyn tied off the bandage. "What do you mean?" She'd stop whatever she was doing when the weather changed, especially snow. She'd just watch it. He turned his attention from Noah back to his arm, examining the bandage. "I thought it was impractical." "Did you tell her that?" "Once." "What did she say?" The corner of his mouth moved in a way she'd learned to recognize as the closest he came to a smile. "She said I wouldn't know impractical if it fell on me." Evelyn sat back. "She was right." He looked at her. "I know." She got up and took the bloody cloth to the wash basin and rinsed it, and when she turned back around, he was still sitting at the table, but he'd shifted his chair slightly toward Noah's crib. Not leaning, just turned, a degree or two, in that direction. She went back to the stove without mentioning it. That evening, she made biscuits from the good flour, the kind she saved for when there was a reason to use it. And when Colton ate them, he ate 3 without stopping and then looked at the remaining ones like he was deciding something. "You can have another," she said. "I know." But he said it without the edge she might have expected, the reflex defensiveness of a man not used to being offered things. He took a 4th and ate it, and that was a different kind of small thing, the kind she was learning to count. It was mid-November when she first got Noah to laugh. She'd been doing the thing her mother had done with her, lifting the baby up quickly and bringing him back down, a rhythm of up and down that most babies found disorienting in a pleasing way. Noah had been tolerating it with his usual serious expression for several passes when something shifted in him and the sound came out. Not quite a full laugh, more of a surprised vocalization, an exhale with a shape to it, but undeniably happy. Evelyn froze. Then she did it again, and it happened again, and she laughed herself, out of pure reflex, and Noah seemed to find her laughing interesting, and the whole thing became slightly circular and ridiculous, and she didn't care. Colton was in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come back. He was standing just inside the door with his coat still on and snow in his hair, watching. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before, not the near smile, something more than that. Something cracked open. She didn't make anything of it. She kept her eyes on Noah and said, "He figured out laughing today, apparently." Colton took off his coat. "How long ago?" "Just now. You caught it live." He came and stood nearby, closer than he usually came when Noah was awake. And Evelyn passed the baby up and down again, and Noah made the sound again, and she heard Colton exhale in a way that had some weight to it. "Do it again," he said. She did it again. Noah obliged. "How does he know that's funny?" Colton asked. "I don't think he knows it's funny. I think he just likes the movement, and the sound comes out." She settled Noah back against her arm. "Babies aren't complicated yet. They like what feels good, and they tell you when they don't. That sounds like a better system than most adults manage. She looked at him. He was watching Noah with his arms loose at his sides and his face still open in that way she hadn't seen before, and she thought that it was probably the most relaxed she'd seen him since she arrived. Here. She held the baby out toward him. He took a step back. Involuntary, she thought. A reflex, not a decision. He won't break, she said. I know that. Do you? The question sat there. He looked at Noah, then at her, then back at Noah. There was a long pause in which she could see him working through something private and difficult. I dropped him, Colton said. 2 weeks after May died. I hadn't slept, and I was trying to... He stopped. He wasn't hurt. He landed on the bed. But I dropped him, and I thought if I... Colton. She said it gently but clear. That was then. He looked at her. You're not who you were 2 weeks after, she said. You're different now, and so is he. Another pause. He reached out and she passed Noah to him carefully, making sure he had the head, and Colton held his son with the stiff, concentrated effort of someone who was also trying not to show how afraid he was, which wasn't smooth or natural-looking at all. Noah looked up at his father's face with great interest. Evelyn stepped back and gave them space and made a project of the stove damper, which didn't need adjusting. Behind her, after a moment, she heard Colton say something, very low. His voice had gone different. She couldn't hear the words and she didn't try. That wasn't hers. When she turned around eventually, Colton was sitting in the rocking chair, the one by the south window, the one he hadn't touched since she'd arrived, with Noah against his chest. He was looking out the window at the snow, and his face was unguarded in a way that would have been too much to look at directly, so she didn't look at it directly. I'm going to start dinner, she said. He didn't look away from the window. She started dinner, and for a while, in the warmth of the stove and the smell of the food, and the small sound Noah made occasionally from the rocking chair, the cabin felt like something other than what it had been. Not fixed, not settled, but different. Chad. December came in with 2 days of solid snowfall that buried the trail and kept Colton off the trapline. He spent the first day repairing equipment inside, methodical, quiet work, and the second helping Evelyn reorganize the supply shelf after she pointed out that the cornmeal was stored next to the lamp oil, which was not an arrangement she was comfortable with. It's been fine, he said, moving the oil to the lower shelf. Until it isn't, she said. You reorganize things when you're worried, he observed. It wasn't critical, just a statement. The kind of observation you only made about someone you'd been watching long enough to notice. She handed him the tin of salt. I do. It helps me feel like something is in order. What are you worried about? She thought about it. The honest answer was several things. The depth of the snow, the rate at which they were going through lamp oil, whether Noah's weight gain would continue or plateau, whether she was doing any of this correctly. The deeper honest answer involved Raymond Hart and the life she'd been pulled out of, and the life she was building here without quite meaning to, and what all of it meant, which was too much to say to a man who was still learning to hold his own baby. The oil supply, she said, and whether we have enough salt to get through February. He accepted this. We have enough salt. You're sure? I've wintered here 3 times. I know how much salt February takes. She nodded. He slid the reorganized tins back into place, and she noticed that he'd arranged them with the labels facing out, which she hadn't asked for. Thank you, she said. For what? For the labels. He looked at the shelf, then at her, as if the connection had been unconscious. Easier to find things. That's why I said thank you. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Close. Those 2 snowed-in days were the first time they were around each other continuously, without the natural structure of his being gone, and her tending the cabin and the trapline providing a rhythm that kept them out of each other's way. It should have been uncomfortable. It was, a little, in the mornings, when the proximity felt like pressure, but by midday of the first day they'd found a working arrangement without discussing it. He at his side of the space, she at hers, Noah as a kind of shared neutral ground, and it eased. She read to Noah from one of the books on the shelf, a story collection she'd pulled because it seemed less likely to bore a baby than the almanac or the surveying manual. She read in a low, even voice, just for the sound of it, just to give him something to track. Colton sat nearby, sharpening a trapping knife, and didn't look up from what he was doing, but after a while he said, "What book is that?" She showed him the cover. "May brought that up," he said. "She liked the third story." Evelyn found the third story and read it instead. It was about a man who got lost in a canyon and found his way out by following a river downstream, and it was well written and quiet and took its time. When she finished, Colton said nothing for a while, and then, "She always said the point was that he stopped trying to go back the way he came." Evelyn looked at the page. "That's the point. I thought the point was that rivers always go somewhere useful." "That too." He went back to the knife. She looked at Noah, who had fallen asleep during the story, slack-jawed and peaceful, one hand resting on her arm. "Colton," she said, can I ask you something?" He set down the knife. "You're going to regardless." "My uncle." She kept her voice careful. "Did he, when you two made the arrangement, did he tell you about my—" She stopped, found a better path into it. "Did he tell you why he was sending me?" A pause. "He said you were widowed, that you had no means and needed a situation." "He didn't mention anything else." "No." She looked at the fire. "He took money from you." A beat. "Yes." "How much?" She'd expected him to refuse the question. He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive kind of quiet, she was learning to tell the difference. And then said, "Enough that I didn't ask more questions than I should have." She absorbed that. She wasn't sure if it made her feel better or worse about any of it. Raymond had needed money badly enough to sell her, and Colton had needed something badly enough to pay for a person. And here she was in the middle of both those needs, trying to build something out of it. "I'm not—" She started over. "I didn't agree to come. I want you to know that, not because I'm planning to leave, but because I think you should know what you actually got, instead of what he told you." Colton looked at her. His expression was steady. "What did he actually tell me?" "That I was willing and capable." "One of those things is true." She met his eyes. "Which one?" "The capable part I've seen for myself." He paused. "The other part, I figured it out. The first day, when he drove away. You didn't say goodbye to him." She hadn't realized he'd noticed that. "You didn't say anything," Colton continued. "You just watched him leave. That's not what willing looks like." She held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable and then looked away. "I should have asked more questions than I did. Before I came." "You didn't have the option to ask questions." "No." She watched Noah breathe. "I didn't." The fire settled. Outside, the snow was still coming, steady and indifferent, as it had been for 2 days. "You could leave," he said. "When the trail opens. I'm not keeping you here." "I know that." "Then why—" He stopped. "Because I don't have anywhere to go," she said. "And because—" She looked at Noah. "Because there's this." He followed her gaze to his son, said nothing. "I'm not staying out of gratitude," she clarified, because she needed him to understand it wasn't pity either. "And I'm not staying because I have to. I'm staying because this child needs someone, and I—" She stopped, started differently. "I lost a baby before I came here. Thomas died, and then I lost. We were going to have a daughter, and then that was gone too, and I thought that part of me was gone with it." She said it flat and factual, the way she'd found she could say it without it taking her apart. But apparently, it isn't. The silence that followed was the longest they'd had since that first night with Noah's crying, and this time it wasn't empty. It was full of things that didn't need saying. "I'm sorry," Colton said finally. The same words she'd said to him, the same plain delivery, nothing performative about it. Just acknowledgement, one loss recognizing another. "Thank you," she said. Noah stirred. His face scrunched and relaxed, some dream logic passing through him, and then he settled again with a small sound. They both watched him do it. "The goat milk," Evelyn said after a moment. "She's going to need fresh hay soon, or the supply will go off. I know. I'm just saying. I know, Evelyn. He picked up the knife again. She turned back to the book, found her page, and outside the snow came down and the fire held, and somewhere under the flat practical exchange of hay and supply schedules, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way they would have been able to name if asked, but shifted, the way the cabin's temperature shifted when the stove found its rhythm. Not an event, just a state that was different from the one before. The trouble began the way most trouble in a closed winter community began, with someone talking. A man named Pharaoh Gids ran the trading post in Millhaven, the nearest settlement, which sat at the base of the Blackhorn Range, some 14 miles down the mountain. Pharaoh Gids was the kind of man who knew everything about everyone and considered that knowledge a form of currency, to be spent strategically for maximum return. When Colton came down in late November for supplies, Gids had apparently asked, with elaborate casualness, who the woman was he'd taken up at the cabin. Colton had said she was a hired housekeeper and offered no further information, which was exactly the wrong thing to say to someone like Gids, because the absence of information was itself information. Evelyn didn't learn this until December, when Colton came back from a supply run with flour and salt and a look on his face that was doing work to stay neutral. Gids asked about you again, he said, setting the sacks on the table. What did you tell him? Same as before. She thought about this. And? And he said he'd heard from someone that you were the Hart girl, Raymond Hart's niece. He paused. That you'd been sent up here against your will, and that maybe someone should look into the situation. She felt the cold of it before the anger. Who told him that? I don't know. Millhaven is small. Your uncle's from Cutter's Creek, but he passes through when he's buying. He could have said something. He stopped. Or not said something and let them fill in the rest. Either way. She sat down at the table. She turned the problem over. He's checking on his investment. Colton looked at her. What do you mean? Raymond. She kept her voice steady. He sold me here, which means in his mind he has an interest in the situation. If I've gone and become a problem, if there's talk about him, he might try to reclaim me to manage the story. She looked up. Not because he cares what happens to me, because he cares what people think of him. Colton was quiet for a moment. You know him well. I grew up with him. She stood up, because sitting still wasn't something she could do with this knowledge in her. He won't come himself, not yet. He'll let the talk go and see what shakes out. But if it gets loud enough to embarrass him, then he'll come to fix it. And his version of fixing it will not look anything like mine. She was already moving to the shelf, to the list she'd been keeping, supplies, dates, the weight records she'd written in the book. Not because these things mattered to the problem, but because her hands needed to do something while her mind worked. What happens, Colton said slowly, if he comes? What does he actually want? She thought about it honestly. He wants to look correct. He wants to look like a man who made a reasonable decision for a difficult niece, not a man who sold a person. She set the notebook down. If you and I are running some kind of... If he can make it look like I chose to be here in a way that reflects poorly on me rather than on him, he's protected. What does that mean for Noah? She looked at him. He was thinking about it the same way she was. The pieces of it, the angles. I don't know yet. I don't know what he'd use. He doesn't have a claim on Noah. No, she paused. But he might try to find someone who does. The words settled. Colton's face had gone still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Tighter, the kind that came before weather. Nobody's taking Noah, he said. I know. She kept her voice calm because she could see his wasn't quite underneath. I'm just trying to see the whole board before any piece moves. He looked at her steadily. Where'd you learn to think like that? From watching my uncle. She picked up the notebook again, opened it to a blank page. Now, tell me exactly what Gid said from the beginning, and don't leave out the parts you think don't matter. He sat down. He told her. She wrote it down. Not because she'd need the notes, she had a good memory, but because writing it made it concrete, made it a problem with edges rather than a fog of worry, and she'd always been better with things that had edges. Noah woke up while they were talking and started fussing from his crib, and Colton got up without being asked and went to him, lifting the baby with that same concentrated effort that was still imperfect but was getting less afraid. And Noah settled against his father's shoulder with the ease of a creature that had decided, on whatever infant terms he processed the world, that this particular person was safe. Colton stood by the window holding his son and looking out at the mountain, and Evelyn looked at the two of them and wrote down the last of Gids's words, and then sat there for a moment with the pen in her hand. Whatever was coming, she thought, they were not going to meet it separately. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd decided that. She wasn't sure it had been a decision at all, the way most real things weren't decisions so much as states you arrived at without noticing the distance traveled. She set the pen down and looked at the notes and started thinking about what to do. Raymond Hart came up the mountain on a Thursday in the second week of December, which told Evelyn something about his intentions before he'd even knocked on the door. A man making a social call chose better weather. A man with a purpose didn't wait for it. She saw him through the south window first, the shape of his horse and wagon coming out of the tree line, and she stood at the glass for a moment with her hand still in the bread dough and felt the cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "Colton," she said it without raising her voice. He was at the table cleaning a trap mechanism and looked up at her face and then past her at the window, and she saw him read the situation without needing further explanation. He set the trap down. "You want me to send him back?" "No." She pulled her hands from the dough and wiped them on the cloth at her waist. "Let him come. I'd rather know what he's saying to my face than guess what he's saying to everyone else." She didn't go to the door. She let him knock, and she let Colton answer it, because she needed 30 seconds to put herself together into something that wouldn't give Raymond the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. She wasn't afraid, she told herself. She was angry. The two felt similar in the chest, but they operated differently, and anger was the one she could use. Raymond came in with his hat in his hands and snow on his shoulders, and his face arranged into an expression she recognized from childhood, the one he wore when he was managing a situation he'd already decided the outcome of. He looked around the cabin with the assessing gaze of a man checking on property, let his eyes settle on Noah in the crib, and then found Evelyn. "You look well," he said. "I am well." She didn't offer him anything. Not a seat, not coffee, not the small courtesies that would make this feel like a visit. "What do you want, Raymond?" He glanced at Colton, who had remained standing near the door with his arms at his sides and his face doing exactly nothing. "This is a private family matter." "Then you should have stayed in Cutter's Creek," Evelyn said, "because there's no family business between you and me anymore that requires privacy." Raymond looked back at her, his jaw tightened slightly. "Evelyn, I came because I've heard things in Millhaven that concern me. About your situation up here. About whether you're being treated properly." Treated properly. She let the words sit in the air a moment. "You mean the situation you sold me into? I found you a position. You took money for me." She kept her voice even. She'd rehearsed this in her head for 3 weeks, since the night Colton had told her about Gids and his questions. She'd rehearsed it until the emotion went out of it, and only the facts remained, because facts were harder to argue with than feelings. "I know what he paid you, Raymond. I know it wasn't a finder's fee for a housekeeper's position. So let's not do the version where you pretend otherwise, because I'm tired and I have bread rising, and I don't have patience for it today." Raymond's expression shifted. The management face slipped slightly towards something colder, and she recognized that too. The look he got when he stopped pretending and started being direct about wanting something. "You've been up here alone with a man for 6 weeks. Unmarried. Do you understand what people are saying?" "I understand what you're hoping they're saying," she replied. "It makes a better story for you. Makes it easier to come up here and play the concerned uncle trying to save his niece from a situation she got herself into. I'm trying to bring you home." "You don't have a home to bring me to. You made that clear in October." "Evelyn, and even if you did," she continued, because she was going now and stopping felt wrong, "I wouldn't go. Not with you, not back to a house where I'm a burden to be managed and a problem to be solved." She took 1 step toward him, and he actually moved back half a step, which she noticed and filed away. "You took my choices away once. I'm not giving them back to you." The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the horse shifted in the cold. Raymond looked past her at the baby in the crib. His eyes stayed there a moment longer than they needed to. Whose child is that? Colton spoke for the first time since he'd opened the door. Mine. The word was flat and unhurried. I wasn't asking you. You're in my house. Colton's voice stayed the same. Not louder, not harder, just there. So when you ask a question in my house, I'm the one who decides whether it gets answered. Raymond turned to face him fully. He was not a small man himself, but Colton had 3 inches on him and the kind of stillness that didn't advertise itself. The stillness of a man who spent a lot of time alone in terrain that could kill him and had learned that loud and sudden were the wrong ways to be. Raymond seemed to do the math. I'm not here to make trouble, Raymond said. I'm here to see that my niece is in a decent situation. Your niece, Colton said, cooked that bread on the counter, organized those supplies, got my son to the weight he ought to be after months of not thriving, and has been running this cabin better than it's been run in a year. The situation is decent, he paused. Whether you believe that is your business. What you do with it is where I start to care. Raymond turned back to Evelyn. She could see him recalculating the way he always did when one angle closed off, looking for another one, finding a door that opened. The child's mother. Where is she? She died, Colton said. So you have a widow woman living up here, raising your child, no marriage between you. He paused and let that sit, and she could hear the shape he was building with it. That's not a situation I can speak well of to anyone, and I think you both know it. There it was. She'd been expecting something like it, but hearing it said aloud still landed like a hand on the table. She looked at Colton. He was looking at Raymond with an expression that had gone very still in a particular way she'd learned over the past weeks, meant he was past the point of performing patience and into the territory of genuine cold. She caught his eye, just briefly, and gave a small shake of her head. Not yet. Get out, she said to Raymond, not because I'm afraid of what you'll say, because I've said what I needed to say to you, and I don't have anything else, and I'd like to get back to my bread. Raymond held her gaze for a long moment. She held his back. She was the one who'd grown up watching him manage rooms. She knew every move he had, and she stood there and let him know she knew it. He left. He didn't say goodbye. He put his hat on at the door and went out and climbed back onto his wagon, and neither of them spoke until the sound of the wheels had gone back into the trees. Then Colton said, How long have you been planning that? 3 weeks. She went back to the bread. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her. How long before he uses it? Uses what? The decent situation argument. She worked the dough. He's not wrong that it looks bad to people who don't know what's here. Colton was quiet. She kept her hands moving and waited. What are you saying? He asked finally. She didn't answer immediately. She'd thought about this too, in the 3 weeks since Gids's comments had come down the mountain, and she'd turned it over and looked at it from every angle she could reach, and she'd arrived at a place she hadn't expected to arrive at when she'd first come up that road in the October cold. I'm saying he's going to go back to Millhaven, she said, and he's going to say something to someone, and eventually it's going to be the kind of noise that gets official attention. Not tomorrow, not next week. But when he thinks he can make it stick, she pressed the heels of her palms into the dough, and when that happens, he's going to try to use Noah. Colton's silence had a different quality this time. He doesn't have a claim on your son, she said. I know that. But if he can convince the right people that this cabin is that there's something wrong here, that Noah is being raised in circumstances that aren't proper, he can make noise that costs you energy and time and money to fight. And up here in the winter, that's a weapon. She stopped working the dough and turned around. I think we should get married, she said. She'd expected some visible reaction. Instead, he just looked at her with that steady, difficult-to-read expression. You just told your uncle you weren't giving your choices away to anyone. I'm not giving them away. I'm making one. She kept her voice level. I'm not talking about something romantic, Colton. I'm talking about a legal arrangement that protects Noah and gives me standing that Raymond can't argue with. She held his gaze. You'd still have your life. I'd have mine. We'd have an arrangement that makes both of them safer. He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away, and she didn't try to fill the silence with additional argument because she'd said what she had, and the rest was his. "You'd be tied to this mountain," he said finally. "Tied to me. I'm already on this mountain, and I've been tied to worse." Something moved across his face. Not the near smile, something more complicated and less readable. "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm trying to solve a problem before it gets worse." She turned back to the bread. "Think about it. You don't have to answer today." She put the dough in the bowl to rise and covered it with the cloth and went to check on Noah, who was awake and watching the ceiling with the focused attention he gave to things that interested him, which was most things. She picked him up and held him and felt him settle against her, that automatic trust that still moved her every time. And she stood at the south window and looked out at the empty clearing where Raymond's wagon tracks were already filling with new snow. She heard Colton move behind her. Then she heard him say quietly, "What if it wasn't only an arrangement?" She kept her eyes on the window. The snow was coming steadily now, the kind that accumulated fast and changed the shape of everything. "What do you mean?" she asked. A pause. "I mean, what if... I'm not trying to..." He stopped, started over. "May's been gone 8 months. I'm not the same person I was in August, and I don't mean that the way it sounds. I mean, I don't know what any of it is yet." She heard him exhale. "But I know that when you came down that ladder with Noah that first night, I felt something I hadn't felt since she died. Not the same thing, different, but something that reminded me there were things worth..." He stopped again. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely unsure of himself. Not cold, not guarded, just a person who didn't know what words to reach for, and was reaching anyway. "I'm not saying I'm in love with you," he said roughly. "I want to be honest. I don't know what this is." "I don't either," she said, "but it's something." She looked at him for a long moment. Noah made a small sound against her shoulder. "It's something," she agreed. The honesty of it was both less and more than a declaration, less polished, more true. She was 30 years old and had already buried a husband and a child and been sold like an asset on a farm ledger, and she'd decided a long time ago that she'd rather have the difficult true thing than the easy false version. "All right," she said, "then we'll get married because we have to, and also because we want to see what it might be. And we'll see what it is from there." He nodded, slow. "All right. We'll need to go to Millhaven. The circuit judge comes through the first week of January." "I know." "And in the meantime, I'll handle Gids," he said. "He won't say anything that damages you between now and January." She raised an eyebrow. "How?" "Because I'll go down tomorrow and tell him you're going to be my wife, and Gids is a man who respects legal standing above everything else. He'll hold off until he knows which way it comes down." A pause. "He's not malicious, he just talks." She thought about this. "And Raymond?" "Raymond we deal with in January." His voice had gone back to that particular flatness. "Together." She hadn't known, when she'd said it the night before in the context of the trapline and Gids's gossip, whatever was coming, they were not going to meet it separately. That it would become something she'd be standing in the cabin with a baby on her shoulder, actually meaning in a different way. But she meant it now. She could feel that clearly enough. "Go to Millhaven tomorrow," she said. "I'll write it down in the book. January 7th, circuit judge." He almost smiled. "You write everything in that book. It helps me feel like things have edges." This time he did smile. Brief, imperfect, the left side of his mouth pulling up slightly more than the right. It was the first time she'd seen it fully, and it looked like something that had been out of practice. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. The road to Millhaven in January was 14 miles of packed ice and exposed ridge that the wind used as a corridor, and Colton drove it with the horse wearing the heavy chest collar and Evelyn beside him on the wagon seat with Noah tucked inside her coat in the sling she'd sewn from canvas and wool batting. The baby was warm. Evelyn was moderately warm. Colton appeared immune to temperature in a way she'd stopped questioning. They didn't talk much on the way down. There was a particular kind of conversation that the cold made difficult. Anything that required nuance suffered in wind chill. And they'd said most of what needed saying the night before, sitting at the table while she wrote the plan in the notebook, And he listened and occasionally said that won't work, or Gids already knows that part, and they revised until it held together. The plan was simple because simple plans were harder to pick apart. They would marry. They would file the registration with the judge. They would, if Raymond appeared, present the documentation, and if he attempted any claim on either Evelyn or Noah, Colton would speak to the county clerk about the original transaction, the money Raymond had accepted, which under territorial law looked considerably less like a placement fee and considerably more like something the clerk would want to ask questions about. Evelyn had thought of that part. Colton had looked at her when she said it with the same expression he'd had the first night she'd come down the ladder with Noah, something readjusting behind his eyes. "You'd use that against your own uncle," he said. "Not a judgment, just a statement." "You used me against myself," she said. "That's a different thing." Millhaven in January was 3 streets of mud and packed snow with a trading post, a smithy, a boarding house that served food, and the county clerk's office where the circuit judge held his sessions the first Thursday of each month. It was a small place, and it knew itself as such, and everyone in it was conscious of everyone else's business in the way of small places that had nothing else to occupy the mind in winter. Evelyn felt them looking when the wagon came down the main street. She'd expected it. She kept her posture straight and her expression neutral and held Noah against her chest and looked back at anyone who looked at her long enough to warrant it. Pharaoh Gids was outside his trading post when they passed. He was a heavy-set man with small, quick eyes and a manner that tried to seem friendly while missing something essential about what friendly actually felt like. He raised a hand when he saw Colton, and his eyes moved to Evelyn, and she held his gaze until he was the one who looked away. They went to the clerk's office first. The circuit judge, a man named Holt with a gray mustache and a manner of great bureaucratic precision, was already there, working through a stack of papers with a pen that scratched loudly in the quiet room. "Voss?" he said without looking up. "Judge Holt." Colton took off his hat. "We're here to file a marriage registration." Holt looked up. His eyes moved over Colton, then Evelyn, then Noah. The baby's dark head was just visible above the collar of her coat. And then back to the paperwork with the equanimity of a man who had processed more unusual things than this in his tenure. "Names," he said. They gave them. He wrote. He asked the standard questions: age, prior marriage, current residence, and Evelyn answered them in a steady voice while Noah made a small sound and tried to push his face out of the coat, apparently curious about the office. She tucked him back gently without breaking her answer to Holt's question about her previous husband's death, and Holt wrote that down too. "Any objections to this union filed or expected?" he asked, in the tone of someone asking it as a formality. Evelyn said, "There may be an objection raised by Raymond Hart of Cutter's Creek, who is my mother's brother. He does not have legal standing to object, and I want that noted." Holt looked at her over his mustache. "Reason for anticipating the objection?" "He brought me up the mountain in October under an arrangement he made with Mr. Voss without my consent. He may choose to characterize the situation in a way that suits him." She kept her voice even and precise. "I want the record to reflect that I am here voluntarily, that I am of legal age and full capacity, and that I am making this choice without coercion." Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something down, slowly and deliberately. "So noted," he said. The ceremony, such as it was, took 11 minutes. Judge Holt had a particular style, stripped of anything ceremonial, focused on the legal language with the concentration of someone who considered the words a mechanism rather than a ritual. Evelyn listened to the mechanism and said the words she was supposed to say, and looked at Colton when the looking was required. He looked back at her. His eyes were steady, and that was enough. When it was done and the paper was signed and Holt had stamped it and handed it over, Colton folded it and put it inside his coat in the breast pocket close to his chest, which struck her as unexpectedly careful, of a large thing accomplished, the way that real moments so often felt less than their weight until you were some distance from them and looked back. "All right," she said. "All right," Colton said. They went to the boarding house for food because it was midday and 14 miles back was a long way on an empty stomach, and because Evelyn felt, obscurely, that they deserved the ordinary thing of a hot meal in a warm room. They were halfway through it, venison stew and cornbread, the stew overworked but hot, the cornbread better than she'd have expected, when the door opened and Raymond Hart came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she could see him taking in the scene. The two of them at the table, the baby in the sling, the particular arrangement of ordinary domesticity. And she could see him recalculating in the way she'd watched him recalculate her whole life. He came to the table. He didn't sit. "I heard you were in town," he said. "Word travels fast in Millhaven," Evelyn said. "I want to talk to you. Alone. There's nothing you need to say to me that Colton can't hear." She picked up her spoon. "Sit down or don't, but I'm going to finish this stew either way." Raymond pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He put his hat on the table and smoothed the brim, the same gesture he always made when he was building to something. He looked at Colton first, calculating, and then back at Evelyn. "I came to apologize," he said. She'd expected a number of things. This wasn't one of them. She kept her face even and set her spoon down. "For sending you up here the way I did," he continued. "I was in a bad way with the farm, debt I didn't tell anyone about. Voss had offered a good sum, and He stopped. "I told myself it was a reasonable solution, that you'd be cared for, and I'd be clear of the debt, and everyone would be better off." "That's a generous account of selling a person," Evelyn said. "I know it." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have—" He stopped again. "It was wrong. I'm telling you it was wrong." She studied him. She'd known Raymond Hart her whole life, and she knew every register of his voice, and this one was one she'd heard rarely. The register of a man who had looked at himself and not liked what he saw and was saying so out loud because the alternative was carrying it alone, which was harder. She didn't think it was performance. She thought it was real. That made it more complicated. "I believe you," she said finally. "I believe it's wrong is what you think." She folded her hands on the table. "But believing you were wrong doesn't change what you did, and it doesn't give you any standing here. I've made my life on this mountain. I didn't ask for it, and I didn't choose it the way you're supposed to choose things, but it's mine now." She held his gaze. "And it's going to stay mine." Raymond looked at her for a long time. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe just tired. "You always were the most—" He stopped. "Your mother's daughter, that's all." "She'd have said worse," Evelyn replied. Something moved across Raymond's face that wasn't quite a smile. He looked at Noah, who had freed an arm from the sling and was engaged in a determined effort to touch the edge of the table. "The baby looks healthy," he said. "He is." A pause. "I heard you married this morning." "You heard right." He looked at Colton. Colton looked back. The look between them contained a great deal of history that had never been put into words and never would be. And then Raymond picked up his hat and stood. "I won't be back up the mountain," he said, "for whatever that's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "Not everything, but something." He nodded. He put his hat on. He went to the door and she watched him go and felt the complicated weight of it. Not relief exactly, not forgiveness exactly, but the peculiar lightness of a thing that had been held a long time being set down. Noah got his hand on the table edge. He gripped it with fierce concentration and banged it once, satisfied. Colton looked at his son. "He's going to be loud when he gets more confident." "He's going to be exactly like you," Evelyn said. "Quiet until he's certain, and then completely sure of himself." He looked at her. "That's not necessarily a compliment." "I know." She picked up her spoon again. "I didn't necessarily mean it as one." But she was almost smiling when she said it, and he could see that, and he looked away first, back to the stew, though the set of his shoulders had changed in the way she'd learned to read as something opening rather than closing. They finished the meal. They settled the bill. They walked out into the cold Millhaven street with the paper in Colton's breast pocket and the road home ahead of them, 14 miles of ice and wind, and the mountain that had somehow, without her planning for it, become the place she came back to. Noah slept against her chest the whole way up, heavy and warm and completely trusting, and the cold was real, but the wind had dropped, and by the time the cabin came out of the trees in the late afternoon light, it was exactly what it had become over these past months. Not perfect, not easy, but hers. She didn't know what January would bring after this, or February, or the long, slow unthaw of spring. She didn't know what she and Colton were, or what they were going to be. She knew the paper was in his pocket, and the baby was breathing, and the woodpile was high enough to get through the worst of the season. And for now, standing in the clearing with the last light going pink off the snow, that was enough to stand on. She went inside and got the fire going and started on dinner. And Colton fed the horse and checked the barn, and Noah lay in his crib and watched the firelight move on the ceiling with the same serious, fascinated attention he gave to everything, and the cabin held its warmth against the mountain's cold the way it had learned to do. The paper stayed in Colton's breast pocket for 3 days after they came back from Millhaven, which Evelyn knew because she'd seen him check for it. A small, unconscious gesture, the back of his hand against his chest, confirming it was there. She didn't mention it. There were things a person needed to carry a certain way and at a certain pace, and she'd learned enough about him by now to leave those things alone. January settled hard over the mountain. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made the cabin walls contract at night with sounds like distant rifle shots, sharp cracks that used to wake her in the first weeks, and now she barely registered. Noah had started sleeping longer stretches, 5 hours, sometimes 6, which gave her body enough rest to feel like itself again, and gave her mind, unfortunately, more room to think. She thought about Raymond's face in the boarding house, the tiredness in it, the thing he'd said about her mother. She turned it over the way you turned a stone in your hand, feeling the weight and temperature of it, and she arrived at the same place every time. She believed he was sorry. She just didn't know yet what to do with that, or whether it required her to do anything at all. Forgiveness was not a debt she owed anyone, and she'd spent enough of her life paying debts that weren't hers. Colton came in from the trapline one afternoon to find her standing at the south window with Noah on her hip, both of them watching the snow. He came and stood nearby, not beside her, just in the general vicinity, the way he moved into shared space now, without making an announcement of it, and looked out at the same thing they were looking at. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered lying, or at least simplifying. "Raymond." "What about him?" "Whether I'm supposed to feel something more resolved than I do." She shifted Noah's weight. "He apologized, and I believe him, and I still feel—" She searched for the word. "Unfinished." Colton was quiet for a moment. "Resolved and unfinished aren't opposites," he said. "You can know how something ends and still not be done being in it." She looked at him. He was watching the snow, not her. "That's an unexpectedly precise thing to say." "May said it." He paused. "About her father. He did something when she was young. I never knew the whole of it. She didn't want to tell it. And when he died, she said she felt resolved and unfinished at the same time, and she didn't know what to do about it either." He put his hand in his coat pocket. "She figured out that the answer was nothing. You don't do anything about it. You just carry it differently as time goes on." Evelyn looked back out the window. Noah grabbed at the glass with one small hand, leaving a smear she'd wipe off later. "She sounds like she was worth listening to." "Most of the time." The corner of his mouth shifted. "When she wasn't being stubborn." "Was she stubborn often?" "Almost constantly." The shift became something closer to an actual smile, brief and unguarded. It was her best quality. It was also her most infuriating one, which she was completely aware of. "She sounds like she knew herself well. Better than anyone I've ever met." He was quiet a moment. "She'd have liked you, not immediately. She took her time with people, but eventually." He glanced sideways at her. "She'd have said you were practical in a way that wasn't cold, which was what she respected most in a person." Evelyn absorbed this. It was the most he'd said about May at one time, and she felt the weight of it, not as something uncomfortable, but as something handed over carefully, the way you handed over something fragile. "Thank you," she said. "For that." He nodded once and went to the stove to warm himself, and she stayed at the window with Noah until the light went, and the unfinished thing about Raymond sat in its place, and she let it. The second week of January brought a visitor neither of them had anticipated. His name was Aldrich Marsh, and he came up the mountain with the careful deliberateness of a man who had prepared for the trip rather than made it spontaneously. Good gear, a well-provisioned horse, a leather satchel of the kind that held documents rather than supplies. He was perhaps 50, with a neat gray beard and eyes that moved quickly over everything they landed on, and took notes internally in a way she could almost see happening. He introduced himself at the door as an associate of the Territorial Land Office. And when Colton let him in and he sat at the table and opened the satchel, what he produced was not the land claim issue she'd half expected, but something more targeted. A letter, hand-delivered to the county clerk's office in Millhaven, from a man named Dressed Calloway of the Territorial Orphan Welfare Board, asserting concerns about the welfare of one Noah Voss, infant, currently residing in a remote location under ambiguous parental supervision. Colton read the letter standing at the table. His face went through several things in quick succession and then settled into the particular stillness that Evelyn had learned to be more alert to than his anger, because stillness in him was the thing that came before something irrevocable. She put her hand on the table between them, not touching him, just there. "Who is Dressed Calloway?" she said to Marsh. "And what is his connection to Raymond Hart?" Marsh looked at her with a slight adjustment of his expression. He'd been calibrating to Colton, she could tell, expecting the man of the house to run the conversation, and she'd redirected it without asking permission. "Mrs. Voss?" he said. "That's right." She sat down across from him. "Who is Dressed Calloway?" Marsh set the letter back in his satchel. "Mr. Calloway is a legitimate member of the Welfare Board. The letter represents a formal inquiry, not an action. No one is removing any child from anywhere at this stage." "I understand that," she said. "But formal inquiries come from somewhere. Who prompted it?" Marsh looked at his hands, then back at her. He had the manner of a man who dealt in official language for a living and found direct questions mildly disorienting. "The inquiry was filed on the basis of a concerned community member's report. Raymond Hart. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. The quality of his non-answer was confirmation enough." Colton set the letter down. "My wife just told you he said he was done. If the community member is Mr. Hart, I can't speak to what he told you privately." Marsh opened a different folder. "What I can tell you is that the inquiry raises 3 specific concerns. First, the remoteness of the location relative to medical care for an infant. Second, the recent and rapid nature of the marital arrangement. Third," he paused. "Third, an assertion that the child's mother's family may have an interest in the child's welfare that has not been considered." The room went quiet in a different way than it usually did. "May's family," Colton said. His voice had gone very flat. "Her family is a brother in Bilson County who couldn't find this mountain with a map and a full day's head start, and who visited exactly once after she died and spent the visit telling me I should sell the cabin and move to town. I understand, Mr. Voss, and who did not ask a single question about Noah." He pulled out the chair and sat down, and the controlled force of it said more than if he'd thrown the chair. "So if someone has convinced Dressed Calloway that Dale Renner has a sudden interest in his sister's child, someone is using Dale Renner, and I'd like to know who and how." Marsh looked at him steadily. "I'm not here as an adversary. I'm here because the inquiry was filed and my office has an obligation to follow up on filed inquiries. That's the whole of my purpose today." "Then what do you need to see?" Evelyn asked. Marsh turned back to her. "The child's current condition, documentation of the marriage, and ideally, some sense of the domestic situation that I can report back as stable." "The child's current condition," Evelyn said, "is considerably better than it was 3 months ago, which I can demonstrate with weight records." She got the notebook from the shelf, the cracked spine book where she'd been recording Noah's numbers since November, and set it open on the table in front of Marsh. "He was severely underweight in October when I came up the mountain. He's now within normal range for his age. His color is good. He sleeps adequately. He eats consistently." She turned the notebook toward him. "Those are the numbers. They go in one direction." Marsh looked at the notebook. He looked at it for a while, and she could see him reading the dates, the entries, the marginal notes she'd made about method and change. "You kept records," he said. "I keep records of things that matter." Colton got up and went to the crib and came back with Noah, who was awake and had his fist in his mouth and appeared entirely unimpressed by the official nature of the proceedings. Colton sat back down with his son held against his chest in the way he now did without visible effort, the same way he'd once been afraid to, and Noah looked at Marsh with the frank appraisal of someone who had not yet learned to be polite about curiosity. Marsh looked at the baby for a moment. Something in his official manner shifted by a small degree. Not unprofessional, just human. He looks well, he said. He is well, Colton said. The marriage documentation, Marsh said. Colton reached into his breast pocket and laid the paper on the table. Marsh read it. He read the judge's notation, the one Evelyn had requested about her voluntary presence, and his eyes moved over it twice. Judge Holt noted this at your request, he said. At mine, Evelyn confirmed. I wanted it on record that I came here freely. I anticipated someone might eventually try to characterize it otherwise. Marsh folded the paper and handed it back. That was foresighted. I had reason to be foresighted. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd taken over the conversation. She looked back. There was a moment of straightforward assessment passing between them. Not combative, just honest, and she felt him arrive at something. The third concern, he said, about the child's maternal uncle, Dale Renner. He pulled out a different document. Were you aware that Mr. Renner has filed a petition asserting that as the closest living relative of the child's deceased mother, he ought to have some formal role in determining the child's placement? Colton's face did something sharp and fast. Placement. The language of the petition, not my characterization. Noah is not in need of placement, Colton said. He has a father, he has a mother. He used the word without hesitation, without looking at Evelyn, and she registered it in her chest. Not as a romantic thing, but as something weightier than that, the plain declaration of a fact. He has a home. He has weight records in that notebook, and a crib by the stove, and a goat in the barn that he's going to be fascinated by as soon as he can walk. There is no question of placement. Marsh nodded slowly. I understand that, Mr. Voss, but the petition creates a legal process that my office cannot simply ignore. What I'm going to recommend when I file my report is that the inquiry be closed on grounds of child welfare, because what I'm looking at in this room does not support any concern about this child's welfare. He looked at Noah again. But the petition for Mr. Renner is a separate matter. That will go before Judge Holt at the February session, and you'll need to appear. We'll appear, Evelyn said. Marsh closed his satchel. He looked at her one more time. Mrs. Voss, when I write my report, I'm going to note the weight records and the marriage documentation and my direct observation of the child's condition. Is there anything else you'd like the record to contain? She thought about it. Yes, she said. Please note that Noah Voss was in critical condition when I arrived in this household in October, that he had not been adequately fed or cared for due to his father's profound grief at the loss of his wife, that over the past 3 months his condition has improved entirely through consistent care by both his father and myself, that the instability in this household was not a present condition but a past one, and that it has been addressed. She paused. And please note that the inquiry itself, if it originated with Raymond Hart and was channeled through a welfare board contact, represents an attempt to use a child's welfare as a legal instrument for personal reasons, and that my office, your office, ought to be aware when that's happening. Marsh had been writing. He finished, capped his pen, and stood. You're a careful thinker, Mrs. Voss. I had to become one, she said. He left shortly after, his horse picking its way back through the snow toward the tree line, and they stood at the window and watched him go. Renner, Colton said. The word was tight. Dale Renner hasn't written me a letter in 8 months. He sent a card when May died and visited once, and that was everything. He turned from the window. Someone got to him. Raymond. Why? He said he was done. He said he wouldn't come back up the mountain. She moved Noah in her arms. The baby was getting heavy. That weight gain she'd been tracking was real and palpable. He didn't say he was done. He said what he said to make me feel like things were settled. And then he went home and he was angry, and he used what he had. Colton sat down in the rocking chair. He looked at Noah, and she could see him working through the anger the way she'd watched him work through other things. Not suppressing it, but finding the shape of it, figuring out where it fit relative to what needed doing. What do we do about Renner? We find out what he was told. She sat down across from him. Dale Renner is a man who was probably approached by my uncle, or someone Raymond knows, and told something. Maybe that Noah isn't being properly cared for. Maybe that you're not fit. Maybe just that he has a legal right he wasn't aware of and someone wants to help him exercise it. She thought about the man Colton had described, the brother who'd visited once, who'd suggested selling the cabin. He's not a villain. He's a man who was given a reason. So we remove the reason. We show him the notebook, she said. We show him what you showed Marsh, what's in this room, what Noah is, who we are. She looked at Colton steadily. He's May's brother. He loved her, probably. If someone has convinced him that her son is in a bad situation, we show him the son. Colton was quiet for a long time. Noah had gone to sleep against Evelyn's shoulder, his breathing the slow, unconscious rhythm of deep infant sleep, utterly at ease. You want me to write to him? I want us to invite him here, before February, before the session. She kept her eyes on him. Because a man who has seen his nephew healthy and loved and in a warm house with two people who would fight anyone who tried to take him is a man who withdraws his petition. And if he won't come, then we go to him. He looked at her. You take Noah to Bilson in January. I'd take Noah to the end of the world in January if it meant keeping him safe. She said it without drama, just as a fact. But I don't think it'll come to that. I think Dale Renner is a man who was given half a story, and he'll recognize the other half when he sees it. Colton rested his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands. She watched him work through it, the stubbornness and the pride and the reasonable anger, and underneath all of it, the thing he always came back to now. Noah. The calculation that everything else lost to. I'll write the letter tonight, he said. I'll help you with it. He looked up. There was something in his expression she'd been seeing more of lately. Not the near smile, something quieter than that. The look of a man who kept being surprised by the same fact and hadn't yet figured out how to stop being surprised by it. You're going to rewrite the whole thing, he said. I'm going to suggest some adjustments. You're going to rewrite the whole thing and then tell me it was my idea. She almost laughed. That depends entirely on how the first draft reads. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. She'd stopped counting how many times it had almost happened, because it happened more now, and each time it was different, and she'd started thinking of it as its own language, one she was slowly learning. Dale Renner came to the mountain on the 22nd of January. He was not what she'd pictured from Colton's description. She'd imagined someone colder, more maneuvering. But the man who came into the cabin was in his mid-30s, with May's dark coloring and a face that was tired and uncomfortable, and looked like a man who had not been certain, for a while, whether he was doing the right thing. He stood inside the door and looked at the cabin and looked at Noah in the crib and didn't say anything for a moment. He has her eyes, he said, finally. Colton said, I know. The silence between them was the complex silence of men who had lost the same person from different angles and never talked about it. Evelyn stayed at the stove and gave it time. She'd made coffee. She poured it and put it on the table and let them sit down. And she brought Noah to the table and sat with him, and Dale Renner looked at his nephew with an expression that was trying not to be as moved as it was. He's bigger than I thought he'd be, Dale said. He's been gaining, Evelyn said. Here. She got the notebook because the notebook was the most honest thing she had, and she set it in front of him and let him read. She watched him move through the dates and numbers and notations, and she watched the expression on his face change as he read, reading backward through the months, understanding what October had looked like and what January looked like, and the distance between them. He looked up when he'd finished. Who kept these records? I did, she said. Every few days? Every few days. More often when I was worried about the trend. He looked at Noah, then at the notebook, then at Evelyn, then at Colton. He closed the notebook carefully. I was told he wasn't being properly cared for, he said. I was told the situation was unstable and that someone needed to look out for May's boy. Who told you? Colton said. Dale looked at his coffee. A man came to my door in Bilson, said he was a friend of the family, had a letter with him from a Raymond Hart. Colton looked at Evelyn. She looked back, keeping her face even. So Raymond had been the hand behind this after all. Not a withdrawal, just a different move. She'd been right to think so, and being right about it didn't make it less exhausting. What did the letter say? She asked Dale. that May's child was being kept in a remote location with an unstable father and a woman of questionable character who'd been brought up under unclear circumstances. He set it to the table. I should have come up here first, before I signed anything. I know that. He looked at Colton. I'm sorry. I should have come to you directly. You should have, Colton said. Not unkindly, but not softening it either. I know. Evelyn watched Dale look at his nephew. Noah was sitting against her arm and examining Dale with the frank, slightly worried expression he gave to new faces. Not afraid, just processing, the way he did everything. Do you want to hold him? She asked. Dale looked at her. Can I? He's your blood, she said simply. Of course you can. She passed Noah across the table and watched Dale Renner hold his sister's son for the first time, and watched the way it moved across his face. Something between grief and something that wasn't grief. The particular mix of losing one person and meeting another who carried pieces of them. Noah looked up at Dale with focused attention. He reached out and grabbed Dale's beard with both hands. Dale made a sound that was mostly surprise and partly something else. He does that, Colton said. May used to pull my beard too, Dale said. When we were kids. His voice had gone rough. He didn't look up from Noah. Evelyn got up quietly and went to the stove, because some things needed less witnessing and more space, and she stirred the pot that didn't need stirring and listened to Dale talk to Noah in the low voice of someone who didn't entirely realize they were doing it, and let the room be what it was. After a while, Colton said, We need you to withdraw the petition. Dale didn't answer immediately. Noah had let go of his beard and was now attempting to remove his coat button, which was apparently equally interesting. I know, Dale said. The February session. I know, Colton. I'll go to the clerk's office in Millhaven before I head back. He finally looked up. The petition shouldn't have been filed. I let someone talk me into something I should have investigated first. He glanced at Evelyn. I'm sorry to you especially, Mrs. Voss. The way Hart described your situation, I know what he described, she said. I've been the subject of Raymond Hart's descriptions my whole life. He's not a good man, Dale said. He's a complicated man, she said, and she surprised herself with it. She thought of the boarding house, the tiredness on Raymond's face, the words about her mother. He did a wrong thing, and he knows it. That doesn't make him good. But it doesn't make him simple either. She set the spoon down. The petition is the thing that matters now. When it's withdrawn, everything Marsh reported becomes the official record, and there's nothing left to challenge. Dale nodded. He looked down at Noah one more time, and Noah looked back with the same serious, focused attention as always, and Dale laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. He looks like he's figuring out whether to trust you, he said. He is, Evelyn said. He does that. He takes his time, and then he decides. And once he decides, he's completely sure. She glanced at Colton without meaning to, and found him looking at her, and looked away. Sounds like his father, Dale said. It does, she agreed. The petition was withdrawn on the 24th of January, and Marsh filed his closing report on the inquiry on the 28th. And when Colton came back from Millhaven with those two pieces of information and set them on the table, Evelyn sat down and felt the full weight of the past 3 months go out of her shoulders all at once, which was more weight than she'd known she was carrying until it left. She sat there for a moment, just sitting. Colton put water on for coffee and didn't say anything. He was like that. He knew when the quiet was the thing, and he left it alone. It's done, she said, more to herself than to him. It's done, he confirmed. She looked at Noah in the crib. He's never going to know any of this happened. No. That's probably right, she said. Children shouldn't have to know about the fights that were fought for them before they were old enough to fight themselves. She paused. They should just get to be safe. Colton set 2 cups on the table and sat down. He looked at her steadily. Are you all right? She thought about it honestly. I'm tired, she said. I'm relieved. She searched. I'm grateful, which is a strange thing to feel about a situation that started with being sold for silver. Strange isn't wrong. No. She wrapped her hands around the cup he pushed toward her. No, it's not. He was quiet for a moment, then, Evelyn? Hmm. What I said in January, before we went to Millhaven. He looked at the table. About not knowing what this was. What I felt. She waited. I still don't have the right words for it, he said. I want to say that plainly, because you deserve the honest version more than the polished one. He looked up. But I know it's more than an arrangement, and I know it's more than gratitude. And I know that when Marsh walked in here with that letter about Noah, the first thing I felt, before the anger about Renner, before anything else, was that I was glad you were here. Not just practically, just glad. She looked at him. He looked back. He was uncomfortable with the saying of it. She could see that, the way some people were uncomfortable being seen directly. But he was doing it anyway. I'm glad I'm here too, she said, even though it started the way it started. Especially then, she said, because if it had started differently, we'd both be different people. And I think these people, she nodded toward Noah, then let the gesture include the room, the cabin, the mountain outside, all of it. I think these people are doing better than the ones before. He considered this. That's a strange kind of gratitude. I thought you said strange wasn't wrong. The left side of his mouth pulled up before the right, the imperfect smile that was unmistakably his. She'd stopped keeping count of it and started just letting it be. Thank you, he said, plainly. No polish on it. She knew what he was thanking her for, not any single thing, all of it. Noah's weight records in the notebook, the bread, the reorganized shelf, the locked door opened, the conversation with Marsh, the letter to Dale, the 11 minutes in front of Judge Holt. The accumulated weight of a person choosing, day after day, to stay and do the next thing and then the thing after that. You'd have done the same, she said. I don't know that I would have. I do. She looked at him steadily. The man who put his son in a locked room because he couldn't watch him die is not the man sitting here, and that didn't happen by accident. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Noah made a sound in the crib, not distress, just the sound of being awake and interested in the world. And Colton got up to check on him with the ease of someone who had stopped thinking about it and started just doing it. She sat at the table and listened to him talk to his son in the low voice he used, and the fire held, and outside the mountain was exactly what it always was, indifferent and vast and not interested in whether any of them survived. But inside the cabin, the warmth was real, and the weight records were in the notebook, and the paper was in Colton's pocket, and the petition was gone. And all of it was theirs, imperfect and hard-won and entirely real. She opened the notebook to a new page and wrote the date and Noah's weight from that morning and closed it again. Then she got up to start dinner, and the ordinary evening began. February came in quieter than January had left. The legal noise, Marsh's report, Dale's withdrawn petition, the closed inquiry, settled into silence the way most official things did once they stopped mattering, which was immediately and completely. Evelyn had expected to feel more when it was finished, some larger release, but what she felt instead was the smaller, more durable thing, the ability to move through a day without the background tension of waiting for the next problem to arrive. That absence of waiting was, she realized slowly, what normal felt like. She'd been so long without it, she'd forgotten the texture of it. Noah turned 6 months old on the 3rd of February, which Evelyn knew because she'd been counting and Colton hadn't been. And she mentioned it at breakfast, and he looked up from his coffee with the expression of a man who had just understood something he should have been tracking. 6 months, he said. 6 months. She looked at Noah in the crib, awake and engaged in a thorough examination of his own feet, which had recently become his primary area of interest. He was 3 months when I came, so I've known him exactly as long as I didn't. Colton was quiet for a moment. That doesn't seem right. Which part? That there was a time you didn't know him. He said it simply, the way he said most things, without decoration. It doesn't line up with anything when I try to picture it. She understood what he meant. The before felt thin now, like a copy of a copy. The shapes were there, but the detail had gone soft. She remembered the cold of the wagon seat and Raymond's hands on the reins and the letter with its blunt handwriting. But those things felt like they'd happened to a slightly different person, one who shared her name and history, but not quite her center of gravity. She made a small cake that afternoon using the good flour and some dried apples she'd been saving. It was not a remarkable cake. The oven ran uneven and the top browned faster than the middle. And she didn't have sugar to spare, so she used a scrape of the honey Colton had brought up from Millhaven in November. But she put it on the table after dinner and cut it in 3 pieces, and Colton looked at it and then at her. "For Noah's birthday," she said. "He can't eat cake." "I know that. It's not for him to eat. It's for us to mark it." She pushed a piece toward him. Some things deserve to be marked even when the person the thing is for doesn't know it's happening. He picked up his fork. He ate the cake. "It's good," he said. "The top is burned. The middle isn't." She ate hers and looked at Noah, who was oblivious to the occasion and deeply interested in the shadow the lamp threw on the wall above his crib, tracking it with the fixed attention he gave to things that moved. She watched him watch it and felt the full, simple weight of the fact that he was here, this specific child in this specific light, healthy and curious and entirely real, and that 4 months ago that had not been certain. "I want to tell you something," she said. Colton set his fork down. "When I came up this mountain, I thought I was coming because I had no other option." She kept her eyes on Noah. "And that was true. I didn't have another option. But somewhere in the last few months, I stopped thinking of it that way, stopped thinking of this as the thing I got stuck with, and started thinking of it as the thing I chose." She paused. "I know that's not the same as choosing it from the beginning, but I think choice can happen in the middle of something. I think you can arrive at a thing accidentally and then decide to mean it." She finally looked at him. "I mean it. I want you to know that." Colton looked at her for a long moment. His face had the openness it got sometimes late in the evening, when the day's work was done, and the guard he kept without seeming to keep it came down by a degree or two. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." "I hadn't said it." "You said it every day," he said, "just not with those words." She held his gaze. The lamp between them threw its unsteady light, and Noah tracked the shadow on the wall, and outside the mountain was dark and cold and enormous, and none of that touched what was inside the cabin at that moment, which was small and imperfect and entirely sufficient. Spring came the way it always did in the high country, not with the decisive arrival of warmth, but in a series of retreats by the cold, partial, and grudging, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The snow on the trail turned to mud in March, and then froze again at night, and then turned to mud again, and the light changed before the temperature did, coming back longer and at a lower angle that caught the dust motes in the cabin and turned them briefly gold in the late afternoon. Noah discovered his voice in March. He'd been making sounds for weeks, the infant repertoire of grunts and coos and the occasional sharp complaint. But March was when he discovered that sounds could be made with intention, that opening his mouth and pushing air through it in a particular way produced a response in the people around him. He spent 3 days apparently testing this hypothesis with the rigor of a small scientist, making sounds and watching faces and making sounds again. The sound he made most was something close to Ma. He made it at Evelyn first, on a Tuesday morning while she was changing him, and she went very still for a moment. It was not a word yet. She knew that. She knew the developmental reality of it, that babies made sounds that approximated language long before they understood what language was. But he made it looking directly at her face with those serious dark eyes, and something happened in her chest that she couldn't have described in words that would have made it sound like what it was. She pressed her lips to his forehead and stayed there a moment. "All right," she said, the same words she'd said the first night she'd brought him down from the locked room, the same words that had meant, "I've got you," without saying it. "All right." She told Colton that evening, matter-of-factly, the way she told him most things. "Noah said Ma today." He looked up. "Said it?" "Made it, approximated it." She kept her voice practical. "He was looking at me." Colton was quiet for a moment, then, "He knows who you are." "He knows I'm a consistent presence who feeds him," she said. "That's what it means at this age." "That's what it means at every age," Colton said. "A consistent presence who shows up." He went back to what he'd been doing, the quiet emphasis of a man who'd said the thing he meant to say and didn't need to elaborate. She thought about that for a long time. Dale Renner wrote a letter in March, addressed to both of them, which was itself a small thing that wasn't small. He'd gone back to Bilson after his January visit and withdrawn the petition as he'd said. And the letter that came now was different from anything official. It was just a man writing to his nephew's family, halting and slightly awkward in the way of someone who was not practiced at correspondence but was trying. He wrote that he'd been thinking about the visit since January, that he'd gone home and told his wife about Noah, about the weight records in the notebook, about the way Noah had grabbed his beard, that his wife had cried, that he'd thought about May every day since the visit, not in the heavy, unmanageable way of the first months after her death, but in a different way. More like remembering than grieving, which he hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain. He wrote that he hoped they'd let him visit again in spring, that he understood if it was complicated, that he would make it as uncomplicated as he could if they were willing. Evelyn read the letter twice and gave it to Colton and watched him read it. "Well," she said. "He can come," Colton said. "That's all?" He set the letter on the table. "What else is there?" He looked at her. "He made a mistake. He fixed it. Noah should know his mother's brother. Some people wouldn't see it that simply. Some people hold on to the wrong things." He picked up his coffee. "I did it long enough to know what it costs." She looked at him, at the plainness of the statement, the absence of performance in it. He was talking about the locked door and what was behind it, about the months he'd lost to grief that had turned inward and corrosive. He was not asking for anything in the saying of it, just acknowledging the fact the way he acknowledged most things, directly and without dress. "I'll write back," she said. She wrote the letter that afternoon while Noah napped, telling Dale that spring would be a good time, that the trail would be passable by April, that they would be glad to see him. She wrote it in her own voice, but with the understanding that it was from both of them, and that distinction, but both of them, their household, their shared thing, still arrived with a small surprise each time she reached it, like a step you expected to be higher than it was. April brought the mud season properly, and with it the first real thaw, and with the thaw came the goat's first good milking of the year, and the early green showing on the south-facing slope above the cabin, and the return of the raven that had apparently decided the ridge above the clearing was its territory, a fact it announced at volume every morning around first light. Noah despised the raven. This was clear from the way his face went when the sound came. Not afraid, just offended, the expression of someone whose sleep had been interrupted by a noise they considered unnecessary. Colton found this disproportionately funny. Evelyn suspected the raven reminded him of someone he didn't say out loud. He laughed properly, that April, at the raven and at Noah's face. And it was different from the almost laugh she'd been cataloging for months. Fuller, less self-conscious, the laugh of a man who had started to forget to manage himself in every moment. She was at the stove when it happened, and she kept her eyes on what she was doing and smiled privately at the wall. She didn't say anything about it. Some things you just let happen and don't frame. The trapline work shifted in spring, different animals, different territory, the higher ridges opening as the snow retreated. Colton was gone more, and the hours she spent alone with Noah took on a different quality in the warmer light, less like survival and more like living. She started a garden on the south side of the cabin, turning the ground that had been under snow since October, finding soil that was dark and workable underneath. May's rosemary had not survived the winter on the shelf, but there was a root that had gone dormant in the ground below the east window, and in April it put out 2 small gray-green shoots that she found one morning and stood looking at for longer than was practical. She left it alone. Didn't transplant it, didn't clip it, just left it where it had always been. Some things belonged where they were. Colton noticed the shoots, too, on his own, coming around the corner of the cabin one evening while she was checking the garden. He stopped and looked at them for a moment. She stood nearby and didn't say anything. "She'd be glad," he said quietly. Not to Evelyn, not quite to himself. Just said, the way you said something that needed to exist in the air outside your head. "I know," Evelyn said. He nodded. He went inside. She stayed with the garden a few more minutes in the last light, her hands still carrying the soil from the day's turning, and thought about what it meant to build a life on ground where other lives had been. Not replacing them. That was the wrong idea, and she'd known it was wrong since the first night she'd understood what the locked room held. You didn't replace the people who had been in a place. You carried them forward differently. May was in the rosemary shoots and in the rocking chair by the south window and in Noah's eyes and in the specific way Colton went quiet sometimes, staring at the fire. She was not gone from the cabin. She was woven into it, and Evelyn had come to understand that living here well meant living with that, not around it. It didn't feel like sorrow anymore. It felt like context, the ground the rest of it grew from. Dale came in the third week of April, and this time he brought his wife, Sorsha, a small, direct woman with reddish hair and an openness about her that Evelyn liked almost immediately, which surprised her slightly because she was not someone who liked people quickly. Sorsha walked into the cabin and looked around with quick, interested eyes, and then found Noah and went to him the way people went to babies, as if pulled. "Oh," she said, just that. And then, "He looks like her, around the eyes." "He does," Colton said. She looked up at him and something passed between them. The acknowledgement of a shared loss, not dramatic, just true. "She talked about you all the time," Sorsha said. "Before. She used to say you were the most stubborn man she'd ever met, and that was the only thing that made the mountain livable." Colton looked at his boots. She wasn't wrong. She never was, about important things. Sorsha looked at Evelyn. "And she'd have had a great deal to say about you, I think." Evelyn met her eyes. "Good or bad?" "Knowing May? Both. In the same sentence, and she'd have meant it as the highest compliment." Sorsha smiled. She liked complicated people. She said simple people were boring and stubborn people were interesting, and you look to me like someone who's been both at different points in the same week. Evelyn laughed. A real one, unplanned. "Most weeks," she admitted. They stayed 2 days, and in those 2 days the cabin held more people than it had since, Evelyn realized, doing the math, probably since May had died. The four of them sat at the table for meals, and the conversation was real conversation, the kind with more than one current running through it, and Noah presided over all of it from his crib or from various sets of arms, with the seriousness of an infant who understood that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't parse the details. On the second evening, after Sorsha had gone to bed and Dale was sitting by the stove with Noah on his lap, Colton went outside to check the barn, and Evelyn sat at the table and watched Dale with his nephew and thought about the strange routes things took to arrive where they were supposed to be. She thought about the letter. No trouble wanted, no trouble given, and the wagon seat in October and the sound she'd heard through the locked door. She thought about what would have happened if she'd gone back to sleep that night. If she'd accepted what she'd been told was not her concern and rolled over in the cold and put the sound out of her mind. She'd been very close to doing that. She knew it honestly. She'd been tired and frightened and already worn down by everything October had done to her, and the easiest thing would have been to stay in her bed. She hadn't, and she didn't think of that as heroism, which was a word for stories about people who were sure of themselves before they acted. She'd been uncertain and afraid, and she'd gotten up and done it anyway. And the difference between those two things mattered more than most people admitted. You didn't need courage in the absence of fear. That was just easy. You needed it in the presence of fear. With the bed still warm behind you and the reasons to stay outnumbering the reasons to go. And you got up anyway because something was crying and you were the only one who heard it. She thought that was probably the truest thing she'd learned in the past 6 months. Not a lesson she'd set out to learn. Not something anyone had taught her. Just the thing that the specific shape of her particular circumstances had handed her. Most real things came that way. Dale looked up and caught her watching him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "October," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked back at Noah. "I'm sorry for what I did. I know I said it before." "You don't have to keep saying it," she said. Not unkindly. "It's finished." "I know, but I want you to know that I know what it could have—" He stopped, started differently. "If Marsh hadn't come up here, if the report had gone the other way, if—" "It didn't," she said. "He didn't." She looked at Noah, at the way he'd curled his small hand around Dale's finger without looking, the unconscious grip of a creature that trusted the hand it couldn't see. That's what I mean when I say it's finished. The version where it went wrong didn't happen. The version where your nephew is healthy and here and pulling your finger is the version that's real. She paused. That's the one we're living in. Dale looked at her. You think like May, he said. That's exactly the kind of thing she'd say. Evelyn didn't know what to do with that, so she just let it sit. Mom. Colton came back in from the barn and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. Dale at the stove with Noah, Evelyn at the table, the lamp burning, the cabin warm with the specific warmth of people in it. And Evelyn watched him stand there and saw the thing that moved across his face, quiet and private, and not entirely caught before it passed. He came in and hung up his coat and sat at the table across from her, and they were briefly side by side in the same frame while Dale and Noah were across the room, and the ease of it, the ease of sitting next to this person in this room, was something she felt without naming. Nanny's settled, he said. Good. The kid she had last month is getting strong. I know. I've been watching her. He glanced sideways at her. You write it in the notebook. I write everything in the notebook. I know you do. He reached past her to refill his coffee from the pot on the table, and his arm brushed her shoulder, and neither of them remarked on it. Dale's wife, Sorsha. She's good, Evelyn said. She's exactly what May said she was. He wrapped his hands around the cup. May always said Dale had better taste than anyone gave him credit for. She was right. She usually was. He said it without sadness now. Or not without sadness exactly, but with sadness in its right place, present and acknowledged and not running anything. The grief was still there. She knew it would always be there, in some form. But it had found its location in him and stopped occupying the whole of the space. That, she'd come to think, was the most you could ask of grief. Not that it leave, but that it find its place. Across the room, Noah made the sound again. The ma sound, directed at no one in particular this time, just adding his voice to the room's general noise. Dale looked at him with delight. Did he just... He's been doing it for weeks, Colton said. He likes the sound of it. May's first word was more, Dale said, which Mama said was appropriate. Colton almost smiled. Evelyn did smile. And Noah made the sound again, twice, because the response it generated was interesting. The Renners left on a Thursday morning with the trail dried enough to be manageable, and they stood in the clearing and said goodbye in the way of people who expected to see each other again and didn't need to make too much of the leaving. Sorsha hugged Evelyn, which Evelyn accepted and didn't brace against the way she might have in October. You're good for him, Sorsha said quietly. Both of them. They're good for me, Evelyn said. That was the whole truth of it. She'd arrived with nothing she wanted and found things she didn't know she was missing, which was not how the story was supposed to go, but was how it had gone, and she'd stopped needing it to be anything other than that. Dale shook Colton's hand and then did something slightly unexpected. He reached out and put his other hand over the handshake. A double clasp, the kind you gave when a handshake wasn't quite enough, but a hug was more than the moment allowed. Colton let him, which was itself something. Look after my nephew, Dale said. I will, Colton said. Then, both of us will. Dale looked at Evelyn and nodded. She nodded back. They rode down the trail and the tree line took them, and the clearing went quiet again. The specific quiet of the mountain after people have left it, which felt emptier for a moment than it had before they'd come, and then settled back into the ordinary quiet, which was not empty at all, once you knew how to hear it. Colton stood beside her with Noah on his arm. The baby was watching the trail where the Renners had gone, processing the departure with his usual focused gravity. He's going to miss them, Colton said. He doesn't know what missing is yet, Evelyn said. He'll learn. Yes, she looked at Noah. He'll learn all of it eventually, the whole range. She paused. That's the part that's difficult about loving someone. You can't protect them from knowing things. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then, no, but you can make sure they don't learn those things alone. She turned to look at him. He was looking at Noah. his expression the particular one she'd come to know best in him. Not guarded, not performing, just present. A man standing in his clearing on a spring morning with his son on his arm and his whole difficult past and uncertain future arranged around him and choosing, in this specific moment, not to be somewhere else. "That's what you had," she said quietly. Not a question. He met her eyes. "That's what I had. Eventually." The pause that followed was brief and full. "Late." "Not too late," she said. "No," he said. "Not too late." Noah reached up and grabbed Colton's beard, which he'd been doing more now that his coordination was improving, and Colton winced in the way he always winced, which was to say minimally, and Evelyn reached up and gently freed the small fingers without thinking about it, the automatic movement of someone whose hands had learned where to go. Colton looked at her hand on Noah's hand on his face and looked at her, and she let herself hold the look for a moment before stepping back and nodding toward the cabin. "Stove's going to need wood," she said. "I'll get it. I'll start the bread." He went to the woodpile and she went inside, and Noah rode along on his father's arm, watching the raven that had appeared on the ridge again, announcing its presence to the mountain with the confidence of something that had decided where it belonged and was not interested in any other arrangement. She thought, standing at the counter with her hands in the flour and the south window throwing its morning light across the floor, about the woman who had sat in that wagon in October with a canvas bag and a letter she hadn't agreed to, and a grief so complete it had felt like her actual dimensions, the walls of the self she'd be living within forever. That woman wasn't gone. She was still there, the way May was still in the rosemary and in Noah's eyes. You didn't lose the people you'd been any more than you lost the people you'd loved. They stayed, woven in, context and foundation. The grief was real, and the loss was real, and Thomas was real, and the daughter she'd never named was real, and all of that would always be true. But it wasn't the whole truth anymore. The whole truth was the flour and the bread and the notebook on the shelf and the weight records going in one direction and the baby outside on his father's arm watching a raven. The whole truth was a locked door she'd opened in the dark, and a marriage that had started as a legal arrangement and become something neither of them had a word for yet. The whole truth was that she'd arrived here with nothing and built something, not from nothing, but from what was already here. The grief and the cabin and the man who couldn't look at his son and the son who needed looking at, and built it with her own hands, day by day, the same way you built any real thing, imperfectly, persistently, without knowing when you started how it would turn out. She shaped the dough. Outside, she heard the woodpile and Colton's voice saying something to Noah she couldn't make out, and then Noah's voice saying something back that was not yet language but was already, unmistakably, conversation. The door opened and Colton came in with the wood and stamped the mud off his boots. He'd been doing that since February, after she'd mentioned it once and she hadn't had to mention it again, and set the load by the stove. He said, "Da," he said. He said it carefully, as if being careful with it. She looked up. "Just now?" "Twice." He picked up the raven from the crib. No. Noah from the crib. She was losing her mind. She almost laughed at herself. He picked up Noah. "I don't know if he knows what it means." "He doesn't know what it means," she said, "but he will." Colton looked at his son. Noah looked back at his father with those serious, dark, patient eyes, the eyes that had been watching everything since the night she'd brought him down from the cold into the firelight, learning the world one face at a time. "Da," Noah said, quite clearly. The cabin held very still for a moment. Then Colton looked up at Evelyn with an expression she had no prior experience of seeing on his face. Not the near smile, not the quiet open look, not any of the others she'd cataloged over 6 months. Something newer, something he hadn't had available until right now. She felt it in her own chest like an echo. "You should write it in the notebook," he said. "I will," she said. "What time is it?" He looked at the window, the angle of the light. 8:30. She went to the shelf, opened the notebook, wrote the date and the time, and Noah said, "Da," twice, clearly, looking at Colton, 8:30, April morning, spring. She looked at the entry. Then she wrote one more thing below it. "We are all right." She closed the notebook and went back to the bread. The stove caught, and the room warmed, and outside the raven called once more from its ridge and went silent, and the spring light came through the south window the way it would come every morning now for the long months ahead, and the three of them moved through the ordinary space of the cabin, imperfect, unfinished in the way that living things are always unfinished, and entirely, sufficiently real. There are things you choose and things that choose you, and the wisest people learn eventually that the line between those two is thinner than it looks, that a life can start as something you didn't ask for and become, if you're honest and stubborn and willing to get up in the dark when something cries, exactly the life you were always capable of living. Not because it was meant to be. There is no meant in a mountain winter, just the next hour, and what you do in it, and who you become by the accumulation of all those hours taken one at a time. Evelyn Hart. Colton Voss now, a name that still sat slightly new in the mouth, had been sold for silver coins on an October morning and had found, on the other side of that transaction, not the ruin she'd feared but the strange, difficult, irreplaceable gift of a life that needed her. And she had needed it back, which was something she could admit now, standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands, in a way she couldn't have admitted when she arrived. That was the whole of it. Not a tidy lesson, not a clean resolution, just two people and a child, making their way through the days with whatever honesty and stubbornness they could manage, which turned out to be enough. It always does when it's real.